Jaya Prabhupada. Vishnu Paramasma Rajakacharya AC Bhaktivinoda Samsha Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ramacharya Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sukha Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasudhi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Sri Sri Radha Krishna Gopal Gopita Sham Kunda Radha Katikiti Govardhan Ki Jai. Sri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Navadip Dham Ki Jai. Gang Jamuna Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Samavetta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Go Premanandi. All glories to some of the devotees. All glories to some of the devotees. All glories to some of the devotees. All glories to Sri Gun Sri Guru. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Vishnu Badai Krishna Vishnu Bodhaya Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Prachadane Nirvasesha Shunyavadi Pasachade Shatadane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 10, Chapter 14, Verse 4. Sriya Sritim Bhakti Mudasyate Vibho Krisyanti Kevala Bodha Labdaye Tesham Asal Kleshala Eva Sisyate Nanyat Yata Stula Tushava Gatinam. Shreya, of supreme benefit. Shritim, the path. Bhaktim, devotional service. Udasya, rejecting. Te, they. Vibho, O Almighty Lord. Klishyanti, a struggle. Ye, who. Kevala, exclusive. Bodha, of knowledge. Labdaye, for the achievement. Tesham, for them, asau, this kleshala, botheration, eva, merely, sisyate, remains, na, nothing, anyat, other, yata, just as, stula tusha, empty husks, avagatinam, for those who are beating. Translation, my dear Lord, devotional service unto you is the best path for self-realization. If someone gives up that path and engages in the cultivation of speculative knowledge, he will simply undergo a troublesome process and will not achieve his desired result. As a person who beats an empty husk of wheat cannot get grain, one who simply speculates cannot achieve self-realization. His only gain is trouble. Purport, loving service to the Supreme Person is the natural and eternal function of every living entity. If a person renounces his own constitutional function and instead laboriously seeks so-called enlightenment through impersonal speculative knowledge, his result is simply the trouble and bother that come from following an artificial process. A fool may beat an empty husk, not knowing that the grain has already been removed. Similarly, foolish is the person who throws his mind and again into the pursuit of knowledge without surrendering to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. For it is the Supreme Personality of God who is the very substance and goal of knowledge, just as the grain is the substance and goal of the entire agricultural effort. Vedic knowledge, or indeed material science, without the personality of God, is exactly like an empty and useless husk of wheat. One may argue that by practicing yoga or cultivating impersonal knowledge, one can acquire prestige, wealth, mystic powers, or even impersonal liberation. But these so-called gains are actually useless because they do not situate the living being in its constitutional position of loving service to the Supreme Lord. Therefore, such results, being superfluous to the living being's essential nature, are impermanent. As stated in the Nrsimha Purana, Patreshu, Pushpeshu, Phaleshu, Toyeshu, Akrita Labhyeshu, Vadaiva Satsu Bhaktyastu Labhya Purushe Purane Mukjai Kim Artam Kriyate Prayatna. Since the primeval personality of God is easily attained by offering such things as leaves, flowers, fruits, and water, which are found without difficulty, why does one need to endeavor for liberation separately? Although the process of devotional service to Lord Krishna is very simple, it is extremely difficult for stubborn, conditioned souls to completely humble themselves before the Supreme Personality of God and absorb themselves 24 hours a day in His loving service. The mood of loving service is anathema to belligerent, conditioned souls determined to defy God and enjoy it. When such stubborn, conditioned souls who attempt to bypass surrendering to God through proud attempts at philosophical speculation, austerity, and yoga, they are turned back to the material platform by the powerful laws of God and violently merge into the heaving ocean of insignificance called the material world. So, here we have a prayer or a praise of Krishna, which specifically condemns impersonal endeavors and impersonal liberation, a realization. So here Brahma states that a person will give up the best path, Shreya Sritim Bhaktim, and instead for his desire for liberation or oneness, he will take to the path of Jnana. So here Bhakti is called the path of Shreya. Shreya means that which is most beneficial, what is benefiting for a person. Now, of course, people will think that material things are beneficial because they support our material body. So relatively speaking, that's so, and therefore the scriptures also provide methods by which we can get our artha and our kama fulfilled. But of course, we also know, according to Scripture, that if we develop attachment to those things, to those actions, and to their results, etc., then we have bondage in the material world. And, of course, these things bring misery because they're temporary, and we lose them, and then we have to suffer. So therefore, they're not ultimately good. They are relatively beneficial for the material body or the mind. So what is really Shreya will be something which is beneficial in all circumstances and beneficial with no bad side effects. That would be the best Shreya. So ultimately, we can define Shreya as that which will give eternal happiness to the jiva in terms of our Shreya. That which gives ultimate happiness to the jiva. That is the best thing, if it's eternal. Now the material attempts are temporary happiness for the jiva. And at that, They're not even real happiness because they're material and the jiva is spiritual, so they're rather contrary. So, therefore we have to strive for that which will give real happiness to the jiva. So the impersonalists will say, yes, real happiness to the jiva is to get rid of ignorance, get rid of bondage, and we get liberation from birth and death, and that is the happiness. That is the shreya of the jiva. That is the happiness of the jiva. So that is true. It is relatively better than attempts for happiness through material things, which are all temporary and become subject to karma, etc. So we get rid of all of that, and we end up with a state of eternal peace for the jiva. That's liberation. However, we may stop there, but if we stop there, then the jiva again is actually deprived of real happiness. So we cannot define happiness for the jiva in terms of absence of suffering. That's not a real definition of happiness. It merely means that we don't suffer anymore. That doesn't really mean happiness. So we find in the material world, of course, the jiva is trying to do two things. He wants to avoid the suffering. In other words, pains to the material body, pains to the mind, etc., and to extend his life, etc. But then there is an attempt beyond that to get some happiness as well. It's not just avoiding the pains of the material world. If we're only trying to avoid the pains of the material world, then why do people get married? They're trying to get some happiness out of that beyond the pains. They could just have their bank balance and live very comfortably, peacefully in their house all day. But they don't do that. Then they try for more happiness beyond the pain. So, in different ways, people try to get pleasure out of things, not just things. And for this reason, they may misutilize their senses, which is the capacity of the human being and not the animals. Animals generally, they confine themselves to certain amounts of enjoyment. And they're limited in how they enjoy. They don't eat too much, they don't sleep too much, they just carry out their activities in a regulated way. Human beings can do all sorts of things to give extra stimulation to their sense. So they overeat, they overdo this, they overdo that, everything they overdo. So this is the problem with the human being. And all of this is an attempt not just to be peaceful, because they're already satisfied in terms of hunger, thirst, etc., but they want to get extra enjoyment, which is what we call kama. So we have artha, to get rid of the suffering, and then we have kama, to get that extra happiness, or whatever it is. So in one sense, of course, artha itself is a type of happiness, just as liberation, negation of material suffering is a type of happiness also. But the jiva is expecting more than that. And we try in the material world, but imperfect. So we go for liberation, and we get rid of the suffering and the birth and death and everything that goes with that. So relatively better state, and it's also eternal. So this is quite attractive to people. So the scriptures often glorify liberation because it is very attractive as an initial spiritual goal, a goal which is eternal. It's quite attractive. But, again, as I said, it's not really complete because the jiva is striving not just for absence of suffering, but he wants some happiness. And that's not available in that liberation because there is a sense of oneness. There is no relationship at all with anything and no perception of anything. There's simply awareness. So, the scriptures then provide a next step, and that is a realization of the Supreme Lord and a relationship with the Supreme Lord. This will give the bliss. This will give the happiness that the jiva requires through a relationship between the individual and Supreme Lord. So this is what is, and this is eternal. Whatever the jiva is striving for in the material world is available on the spiritual level as well. But it involves not the material body, but the jiva, and it involves not material objects, but the Supreme Lord. So the only way that relationship can exist is if the jiva does not have a tendency to accrue enjoyment for himself. So if we establish a relationship without that, this is what we call bhakti. And this leads, the practice of bhakti will lead to the ultimate realization of a relationship with the Lord, so which will give bliss. So that is what is shreya. That is the best, we can say, result for the jiva, the highest goal for the jiva, the most beneficial thing for the jiva. He gets happiness which is eternal. So the path that leads to that happiness, that eternal happiness, is the path of bhakti. So if one rejects that path for some reason or other, and instead struggles for this impersonal liberation, then it says all that you get is suffering. And it compares it to beating the empty husks with nothing in them. So we put forth great endeavor, like beating the husks, and the result is there's nothing there. Nothing there in the sense that there's no realization of the Lord. The jiva doesn't realize anything. He simply exists in a state of oneness. That's it. So the absence of happiness is there. You may get absence of suffering after suffering to get that goal, but he doesn't have a positive type of bliss. So in that sense, he has empty husks, nothing substantial ultimately through that. So the endeavor in jnana is difficult. So that's why it says they struggle, klishanti. They struggle to attain that goal of capable of bodha, oneness, realization of oneness. They struggle to do that. So the path is difficult, and then the result is difficult. What do they get at the end? Kleshala again. It's a useless endeavor because empty, like the husks of the wheat or the grain. So this is a very clear condemnation of the process of jnana and its goal, liberation, in comparison to the process of bhakti and its result, which is prema and eternal bliss. So in no way can we say that the conclusion of Bhagavatam is impersonal, because we have not one statement here, but we'll have repeated statements of condemnation of jnana or yoga, what to speak of karma, and on the other hand, complete endorsement of the process of bhakti and attainment of prema. So there are many, many statements throughout the Bhagavatam, particularly in the 10th canto, to substantiate this. So by no means can we say the conclusion of Bhagavatam is impersonal. There's too many statements to say the opposite. So, of course, in the Bhagavatam, there are impersonal statements in some places. And in the 3rd canto, Kapila Dev, he speaks a whole chapter and part of another chapter on jnana, and some on yoga as well. And in the 11th canto, Krishna talks to Uddhava, and again he spends another chapter on jnana, impersonal type of liberation. So because these chapters are there, some people will say, oh, you see, Krishna is speaking of this impersonal liberation, jnana, as the best also. But of course we know that one of the topics of Bhagavatam is mukti. Liberation is one of the topics. But again, what is the other topic? Asraya. That's the final topic, 10th topic. So, yes, these things are presented in the Bhagavatam, impersonal liberation and the process of jnana. They are presented, but not as the final process. So, they may be regarded as intermediate processes, attractive to some people in the material world for various reasons. And they can strive for those, but they should understand that it's not the complete process. It's a partial process at best, by giving us something rather negative. So, it is popular, one, because it is somewhat reasonable to our logical mind to have an impersonal goal, because we want to negate all of the things in the material world which are temporary. So it applies, it is attractive to logical minds. People who are very logical are very attracted to impersonal philosophy. And of course we know that this impersonalism has a large support of logic. And even logic in India was largely developed by impersonalists. We see the Sankhyas and the Nyayikas are largely impersonal, and then we have the Buddhists, very great logicians. And then we have Shankaracharya also using logic a lot, and to come to a impersonal conclusion. So the logic, of course, is used to negate the material world. So we can use logic in that way, and it's not so difficult to ultimately condemn the material world and regard it as temporary or even as false, as Shankaracharya does and the Buddhists do, by logic. There's ways you can do that. So this becomes very attractive to many people with logical minds, intellectuals, etc. Ah, yes, this is very logical, and therefore they will accept it. So, for some people, therefore, this seems to be the attractive goal, impersonal goal. Of course, ultimately, Scripture and Bhagavatam say that the spiritual goal ultimately is beyond logic anyway. But because people are accustomed to logic, those intelligent people, they depend on that to come to their conclusion. So as long as they're stuck in their logical minds and attracted to logical process, they'll be attracted to such things. And the same goes for science. Some scientists will accept the impersonal conclusion because they are also logical. So they use science and they discuss various things, and with logic, then they conclude something is there which is impersonal, best. So, as the purport mentions, it is rather difficult to come to the conclusion of bhakti for such persons because of their heavy reliance on logic. Right. So that is why in the scriptures itself and in the Sampradaya, we have an insistence on not using or over-depending on logic and depending on the conclusions of scriptures. Now, of course, in India, the sages do depend on scripture. They will quote, Shankaracharya will quote scripture, or the Sankhites will quote scripture, etc. See, scripture also supports what we say. But we should accept scripture, but we should also accept the conclusion of scripture. Because I said Bhagavatam also says impersonal things as well. But we should accept the conclusion of scripture. So that we have to understand, the conclusion of the scripture. So, of course, Bhagavatam is the conclusion of scripture, and the conclusion of Bhagavatam is this. Yes, there is the path of impersonal jnana and liberation, etc., but it is inferior to the process of bhakti and its goal, prema. So the asraya is ultimately established as Krishna. He's the object of worship ultimately. And the process is bhakti. The result is prema. And jnana and yoga and karma yoga are secondary processes for persons who are not qualified for bhakti. And through following these processes, eventually they should get qualified for bhakti if they get good association. So these processes are there in the scriptures, and they are accepted as scriptural things, but they have relative value only. So karma yoga, varnashram have a value, but it is relative, not absolute. And jnana has a value, but it is relative. It is valuable in a sense that it can attract people away from material enjoyment, and they can begin some spiritual process. It is relative in the sense that it's not the highest spiritual process. We have to go further than that. Karma yoga is even more relative. It is simply, let's say, progressing in the material world by regulation, that's all. But by progressing nicely, we become a little detached in sattva, and that allows us to start the process of jnana. So in this way we have the different processes there, and they're all relative except the process of bhakti. So that is pointed out here. The bhakti is the highest process, whatever we may think of the other processes. The other point is, of course, that it is bhakti which will actually give life to the process of jnana or yoga or karma. And on their own, they actually don't give any results. So a person has to struggle here for his liberation. And the final result of liberation is given not by the process of jnana, but the mercy of the Lord. Only if he's merciful. And to get the mercy of the Lord, you have to have a little bhakti, at least a little bit of bhakti. And the same for karma yoga. They also have to struggle to do things perfectly, the different sacrifices, etc. And if they miss or they offend the Lord, Vishnu, again, no result. So other processes are also dependent ultimately on a little bit of bhakti as well for getting their result. So they're partial and also not independent processes. They're also related to the Supreme Lord. So that's why they are mentioned in the scripture, because they are partial processes, steps, so to speak, and they also have a little bhakti mixed in them. And eventually they can help lead to the process of bhakti in an indirect way. So the process of bhakti is the highest process, and compared to the process of jnana, it is also easier. Here it says that the person struggles to get his goal of liberation, etc. And when he gets it, it's also frustrating. So the person who does bhakti does not struggle in the same way. So Bhagavad Gita says the same thing, yeah? Klesha adhikara. It's qualified by klesha, suffering. Why the suffering? Because the goal and our present position are quite opposite. The goal is nothing. No senses, no body, no mind, nothing. And here we have to do our sadhana with a body, mind, and senses in a material world. And the goal is the opposite, zero. So how do we attain that goal through using our senses, mind, and body in the material world? Very difficult. We have to struggle to give up all of our attachment to our body, senses, and mind. Very, very difficult process to follow and to stop them completely from functioning. But that ultimately is the goal, and that's the goal of yoga also. So it's very difficult in that sense. The process of bhakti, of course, also is ultimately all spiritual. There's nothing material also. But it does not reject senses, mind, body, etc. in the spiritual world. They exist, but spiritual. Similarly, the material body and the material senses and material mind are not rejected. They're very useful. So the very definition of sadhana bhakti is to engage the senses of the mind, etc., and the body in the service of the Lord. So this is easier process. We don't have to reject everything. We engage everything in the service of the Lord. So in this way, much, much easier. And, of course, the primary point, of course, is that the process of bhakti is a direct relationship with the Supreme Lord. It is not a subsidiary process as it may be in jnana or yoga or karma, where we acknowledge the Lord a little bit in the process, but mainly we're doing something else. So the main process is serving the Lord, recognizing His position, and cultivating an affectionate relationship with Him. So the process and the goal are similar. The only difference between the process is that we are impure and we have a material body with material senses. But the process activities are the same. The relationship is the same. Other process is not like that. In jnana, the process is quite different from the goal. We have to reject everything that we've done before. So to get liberation, you have to reject jnana, even the process of jnana. You're not continuing the same things at all. It's completely different. So process of bhakti, therefore, is quite different. The activities, we can use the body, etc. Of course, ultimately, what happens is we develop spiritual body and spiritual senses through the process of using our material body and senses. How does it happen? Mercy of the Lord. Power of bhakti does this. So we develop spiritual sense. So therefore, when we become qualified, then we do the same services, the same activities with our spiritual body and our spiritual senses. No difference, except it's all spiritual and it's all on the highest pure level. And here we're doing it with a contaminated consciousness, etc. So the activities, they're all the same. So there is no endeavor to change anything. If we practice and practice and we perfect, we don't have to give it up and learn something else. Do the same thing in perfection. So, easier process. And, of course, it is made easier, or easiest, because it invokes the mercy of the Lord. The other processes do not invoke the mercy of the Lord. But this process does, because it is directly approaching and worshiping the Supreme Lord. Therefore, we get the mercy of the Lord. And therefore, the process becomes easier, because we get the assistance of the Lord to help us progress. So, therefore, this process is much different from the process of jnana or anything else. So, here Brahma is condemning the other processes like jnana because they're too difficult to perform. And the result also is insufficient. Process of bhakti is easier to perform, and it gives the highest result, the greatest satisfaction for the devotee. So very clearly, Brahma has indicated that jnana is inferior to bhakti, not superior to bhakti.
This is regarding the this conclusion of the scriptures, like see, Krishna, he glorified karma yoga, jnana yoga, ashtanga yoga, as well as in the Srimad Bhagavatam also. This even he was telling Uddhava that this is highest, accept this. So there is a glorification of the different kinds of system. So can you take it like an exaggeration?
Yeah, everything is, if things are glorified, and they may be glorified excessively. Huh? So in the Vedas it says that the result of doing sacrifices is you become immortal. Not true, because the sacrifices take you to Svargaloka. It's not immortal, but it says amrita, you become immortal. So that's an exaggeration. It's not actually true, and it's relatively true. You live a long time, then you exhaust your punyas, then you come back here. So it's not eternal. But it says eternal. So that's exaggeration. Of course, not everything is exaggeration. They also tell the facts, as Bhagavad Gita does. It says you go up and you come down again. You return to Margya Loka again. But some statements are there to exaggerate. Why? To encourage people to follow that particular process. Say, oh, eternal results are there for you by doing this process. Highest bliss, etc., etc., etc. So, to encourage people to follow, they do that. Why? Because otherwise they wouldn't practice. We tell them, oh, this is inferior process, don't do it. They won't practice. But they're not qualified for bhakti either. So they encourage them, because they're not qualified for bhakti, to do this, and they exaggerate goals.
Even in the Vedas also different kinds of system are there. It's glorified that if you do this, you can go to heaven and you can enjoy unlimitedly there. Unlimitedly.
Where?
In the Sargaloka.
Yeah.
So it's also like unlimited means so no more coming back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exaggeration.
And another question is like you see, in the beginning, those who are following Karma Yoga, those who are following Jnana Yoga, those who are following the Ashtanga Yoga, they accept the Supreme Lord to get their, to achieve their goal, just all. But at the end, they reject the Supreme Lord.
Yeah.
So means only soul remain, nothing else. The consciousness remain, nothing else. And the consciousness remain, nothing else.
Yeah.
So is it like that committing the suicide also?
Yeah.
At least in the material they have some activities with the senses.
Yeah. So that means that their attraction for that impersonal goal is more than the attraction for the Lord. They accept the Lord in order to get their goal. Once they get their goal, and then they give up attraction to the Lord. They don't have any commitment to Him, and they become more attracted to that impersonal goal.
Attraction only to achieve the goal, that's all.
Yeah.
But if you compare, when those in the material world, although they are struggling, but still they are getting some mental satisfaction, temporary satisfaction. But those who are going to the impersonal Brahman, nothing is there.
Well, there's freedom from birth and death.
That's all. But there is no happiness, nothing.
Well, that's their happiness. Peace. Eternal. Understanding you're eternal, that in itself is the type of happiness for them. They understand they're not in the material body with all these problems and birth and death, etc. Completely something different. Simply to realize they're not in the material body, that is happiness. It's a type of happiness for them.
See, in the material, those who are in a sattva guna, mood of goodness, when they also might feel that, also they are not committing the sinful activities, but they also feel sometimes happiness in the material world. But if
the happiness that they feel in sattva-gun, a real person in sattva-gun, is they get their happiness within because of their understanding that they're not the body, they're the soul. That's their happiness. Of course, that means they have to begin practicing jnana if they want to get the real happiness there. They're satisfied, self-satisfied, and they don't strive for getting satisfaction through their senses and sense objects, etc. To that extent, they're happy, peaceful. So it's relative, of course. They're less agitated by material conditions and material sense objects than the person in Rajagun or Tamagun. So they're peaceful and happy.
What is the only impersonal subclass where is jnana?
Huh?
What is the only impersonal subclass where is jnana? Jnana is gained by any soul who is interested in knowing something about
Yogis also can be impersonalists, and logicians can be impersonalists. Of course, logicians are jnanis in one sense. They may be Sankhyaites, they may be Vaisheshika philosophy also, even different philosophies. They're all called jnanis in a sense because they rely heavily on logic. That's all.
They want to
But generally we're talking about Gyanis, we mean the Mayavadis, which are the main one, currently the strongest form of Gyani. Yeah. Of course, we can also have another category of Gyani who is not opposed to the Lord, but is more interested in liberation. That's the Atmarama type person. They may not specifically reject the Lord, but they're simply interested in liberation.
You mentioned that impersonal liberation is eternal.
Yes, yeah, according to the scriptures, yes. Yeah.
And we also see, I think, probably it's Lord Brahma says, Ye Anya Aravindaksha Vimuktamane, they also fall down. They pray, is it?
Yeah. So that according to Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur, that means the state of a jivan mukta is temporary. That you can get liberation when in your body, and you fall from that position. If you actually liberate yourself completely from material bodies and give up your body completely, that can be eternal.
But again, they stay in the Brahman platform for 50 years. So 50 years you can stay there. After this, you come back again. So Chet Para Ardha, that what is explained.
Never heard that.
I think even Nectar of Devotion, there is a commentary on this, I think. Brahmananda Bhavatesha Chet Paradha Gunikita Noiti Bhakti Sukambhute
50
Paramanantula
years
Bhakti.
is nothing.
Yeah, 50 years of the Brahman, something like this. Say.
Oh, I see.